Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It's such a pleasure to have you again on another wonderful webinar that we are going to have right now, hosted by ex-monks. As we all know that we are celebrating International Coaching Week, which is from 4th to 10th of May. And we are bringing to you a few of the world-class coaches, few of the world-class leaders, authors on this platform. The idea is to serve the coaching community in the best possible manner. Today, it is my sheer pleasure to invite to you and to introduce to you my very dear friend who's a fellow with London Business School. He's an author of 2 books. The first one is Unknown Sense and Common Nonsense. Very interesting topic. I remember when I heard it for the first time, I was quite surprised because it's a very interesting topic. And you would realize that what's the unique thought process that Jules is going to bring for us. Jules has got 4 decades of experience. He's written another book called Being a Leader. Currently, he's a fellow faculty with London Business School. Also, he's a visiting faculty with INSEAD. Jules is he's a PhD student. He was the PhD student in 1980s. So just imagine the kind of work that he has done, the body of work that he has done in his last 40 years of experience. Now, let me share a couple of experiences that I've had with Jules. So I remember my last meeting with Jules that was in London Business School. We were having a meal together. And during that conversation, he shared something really beautiful. And that stayed with me. I was dealing with something in my personal life and my professional life. And I was just discussing with Jules like a friend, like a mentor, like an elder brother, like a philosopher. And he said something really magical. He said, does not really matter what happens to you. What matters is the way you deal with that. At the end of the day, it's just an experience. That stayed with me. That was the time when I thought that no matter what, I have to bring the kind of work that Jules is doing. I have to bring that work to India. So the topic that he's going to talk about today, he's going to talk about leveraging 4D approach in coaching. And the way he defines 4D is destiny, deliberation, development, and drama, where he will take us through what happens to us in our life. You might have, there are 5 fingers in our hand, and there would be some people who would have 6 fingers, and there would be some people who would have 4 fingers. Life happens to all of us. Now, what we do out of that, how much time are we investing to deliberate onto that, and how much time are we taking to develop ourselves from where we are to where we would like to be? That's the journey that Jules is going to take us through. It's a sheer pleasure to have Jules on this call. Now, interestingly, very soon we are ex-monks along with the partnership of Jules. We are coming up with a new program that will help us to further go deeper into your coaching practice. So, ladies and gentlemen, I know you all are really committed to your coaching practice. If you really want to take your coaching practice to a very different level, you have a master to learn from. And my sincere request would be as open as possible. It could be a possibility that whatever he's sharing, you might have some understanding into that. But what I can definitely assure you is the kind of wisdom, the kind of experience, the kind of understanding that Jules would bring in, that would be mind-boggling. So from whether we want to refer to the work of the Socrates or Aristotle, or we would like to involve the work of today's economists or the politicians of the world, Jules would bring everything together so that we can look at a situation from different perspectives and look at experience from different perspectives so that we can shift our perspective to look at a situation so that we can deliberate and develop ourselves. So ladies and gentlemen, without wasting much of your time, I present to you Jules to talk about leveraging 4D approach in coaching. Jules, thank you so much. It's a sheer honor and a pleasure once again, my friend, to have you on this platform. Over to you. Thank
you, Gaurav. You set such high expectations. There's no way I'm going to be able to live up to them. But yes, I remember with fondness, not just the time we had together in London Business School, but before that, if you remember, a wonderful week in Delhi with KPMG partners, where you pulled together the most wonderful program of visits, many social enterprises, some remarkable leaders, And what a wonderful time we had in Delhi. It was lovely. Thank you. Thank you, Gaurav.
Thank you so
Yes,
much.
we have an hour together or something like that. I'm absolutely delighted to be part of this intriguing conference with such distinguished colleagues talking to you as well. Thank you for joining. Yes, I want to contrast, in a sense, two ways of thinking about coaching. I think a lot of executive coaching is very closely related to the world of work. Problems that we're working on, goals that perhaps we're not achieving, frustrations around relationships at work, and so on. What I want to do is to be a bit more philosophical, step back a bit, and think a bit more about ourselves, our lives, the quality of our lives, whether we find our life sufficiently fulfilling. So I'm going to contrast a rather traditional model of coaching with a fresh model, and that's the spirit of the exercise. And of course, at the end, as with other speakers, there'll be plenty of opportunity for you to ask questions, and I'll do my best to answer them. So let me turn to a sequence of slides. Here we are. So let me turn to my first slide. Forgive me for being so hopeless at this technology. So a new perspective on coaching, from coaching around achievement of goals towards a perspective on coaching as being, if you like, truer to our genuine self. And I want to just start with the model that we're all very familiar with. You're all coaches, many of you who have been coached by master coaches. And essentially, this is the model which I expect that we've all grown up with. I first trained as a coach about 20 years ago. I'm not a practicing coach, but I work with many, many coaches at London Business School, and I see how they work, and I admire the extraordinary things that they do. After all, coaching has, in a sense, become a new style of leadership, hasn't it, for executives? And the skill here is to ask really good questions. And these are questions that are open and non-leading. In other words, they need to be answered by something more than yes or no. And they don't contain the answer within them. They're genuinely open questions. And our skill, I guess, is to listen to the coachee, and see the world through their eyes, and try and refrain from judgment. This is very difficult, I think. We want to dive in and offer advice so often, don't we? And yet the skill is to remain, in some sense, apart from the coachee who's walking through their own concerns and their own opportunities and their own frustrations. And the attitude, I think, comes from Carl Rogers. The attitude here is an attitude of unconditional positive regard towards the coachee. We're not there to provide judgment. We're there to listen and to understand, and to help the coachee understand themselves better through the art of our own gift for questioning. And we aspire to be self-effacing. We try and remove ourselves from the conversation as much as is possible, rather in the way that a Freudian analyst might. The Freudian analyst is almost invisible to the client. And of course, the model that many of us will have grown up with is the GROW model, focusing upon goals, the nature of the reality that perhaps is impeding the achievement of these goals, all the options for achieving our goals in new and more effective ways, finding ways of dismantling the impediments or the barriers to achievement, and growing, if you like, the willpower to achieve the goal that we've set ourselves. Now, of course, if we go back to classical Greece, and if we think philosophically, one of the main requirements of thinking philosophically was to be more aware of ourselves as a person. And we were encouraged to analyze our own life and get to know ourselves much, much better. And in the art of examining ourselves, we might be able to find a more fulfilling way of living our life, of becoming true to the person we are. And of course, one of the admonitions of the Greek philosophers was that the art of life is to know ourselves and to discover the person within and to find expression or to find voice for the person we truly are and to live an authentic life as though there were an inner person that we were born with or we were born to be, and finding a way in which that inner person can become whole and effective in life. In other words, to become the person or to be the person we were always meant to be, to, in some sense, to fulfill our destiny. But this was challenged by Aristotle. Aristotle didn't believe, perhaps, that there was a self-defined expression. He believed that it's not so much a question of discovering who we are and living out that person within, but it was a more open notion of selfhood, that the self was there to be invented as much as to be discovered. And his famous phrase here was that it is by acting bravely that we become brave. We pretend to, if you like, be a person of whatever virtue we choose, kindness, for example, and by pretending to be kind, if we do that sufficiently conscientiously, we end up being a kind person. In other words, our personhood is our own creation in some sense. So he would say we invent ourselves rather than discover ourselves. We are, if you like, our life is one of creativity rather than simply self-expression. And rather than being the person we inherently are, the skill perhaps is to become the person we aspire to be. So here perhaps is a revised method of coaching. Perhaps we need to focus our attention on the selfhood or the personhood of our client and find out how our client sees themselves, how they would define themselves, how they might define their identity, what sets them apart from others, what makes them special, for example. And this requires of us, if you like, the technique, as I mentioned earlier, of asking good questions and place those questions in the mind of the coachee. And we're encouraging perhaps the coachee to what's called decenter, that is to see the world through the eyes of others. This in some sense is perhaps the greatest human skill we have, to see the world from different perspectives. We have friends, we have family. How do they see the world? How might they see the world differently from ourselves? And I guess the challenge we have as a coach is to encourage our coachee to see how they are experienced by others, their family, their friends, and of course their colleagues at work. And it becomes perhaps a mutual conversation where coach and coachee are exploring each other's version of themselves, their own search for their own identity or their own purpose in life, the way in which they find meaning in life. And therefore the coach, in some sense, is setting an example of what know thyself and become the person one aspires to be might look like in practice. It was Albert Schweitzer who said that example is not the main thing in influencing others, it's the only thing. We learn by looking at how others behave. If we go back to Aristotle, he would say that as children, let's say if we take courage as one of the great virtues, perhaps the preeminent virtue, we notice when we're children, we notice situations that call for courage, and we see adults behaving courageously or not. And of course, later in life, perhaps as a teenager, we ourselves are faced by a situation that calls for courage. And we have a choice now, don't we? We can pretend to be courageous ourselves, or we can pretend to be anything other than courageous. And perhaps in our minds, we go back to those exemplars, those wonderful examples of courageous behavior, and we pretend to be that person. And as we act to become that person, so in some sense, we acquire some of the virtues of that person. So life, in an Aristotelian way, is a question of continuous reinvention, continuous reconstruction of the person we believe we are and the person we can be. So in some sense, we're exploring our own agency, our freedom of choice, that we can be someone other than the person we are. And therefore, we take full responsibility for the way in which we show up in the world. In some sense, we're led more by curiosity, perhaps, around the person we could become. You know, what if I were to try and become this kind of a person, as opposed to being fixated by unachieved goals? How do I achieve my goals more effectively? How do I achieve more in life? How do I live a more successful life? Perhaps the art of coaching is to move slightly away from being successful and construction. There's a famous way of thinking about how we find ourselves in the world. And there are three dimensions, perhaps, that play a part in whether we find meaning and fulfillment in our life. And here are three elements of that equation. We have a strong sense of who we are. We know who we are in some sense. We know who we're trying to become. That might be called the sense of identity, a sense of personhood. But there's also what matters to me. Where do I find meaning in life? What is it about my own life that's important, that has value, that perhaps contains purpose? So that sense of meaning, that straining for making a difference, of contributing to life, contributing to the life of others, that's where I think the sense of meaning comes from, the things that matter. In some sense, it's the moral space. And finally, a sense of belonging or affiliation. Where do my loyalties lie? To whom or to what do I feel I have a strong sense of belonging? Now, I think in the modern world, we're often encouraged to think of our identity through a rather stereotypical set of labels, often demographic labels like gender or nationality or age or ethnicity. So, for example, I would think of myself as a white English male in his mid-70s, something like that. But these are given, these are not chosen, so to speak. Much more interesting, I think, to cast one's life in the form of those things that we chose to be, rather than things that we simply have been given as characteristics of our life. Here's T.S. Eliot, the great American English poet. He was a naturalized Englishman. He grew up in St. Louis in Missouri in the States. Many of you will have read his poems. Of course, The Wasteland was one of the great poems of the 20th century. And I came across this definition of his identity, his self-chosen identity recently. And it struck me that these are, capta, not data, chosens, not givens. I'm an Anglo-Catholic by religion. I'm a classicist in literature. He stood slightly sideways to romantic literature. His favorite poets were Dante and John Donne and Virgil and so on. So he bent back in time to the great early poets. And he was a royalist in politics, a rather conservative person in terms of his ideology. And I was reflecting on how I would answer that question myself. And I suppose I would say, and I want you to think briefly now whilst I'm speaking, think about how you would spell out some of the core elements of your own identity or sense of selfhood. I think of myself, intellectually at least, as a contrarian. I quite like challenging orthodoxy. I don't necessarily have to believe in the opinions that I adopt for a while. I like to be playful with ideas, and I like to challenge dogma. This is what Goddard was calling uncommon sense, to find a rather unique or different way of looking at the world, hence my interest in reinventing coaching, if you like. I want to challenge some of the conventional models. So I think of myself as a contrarian in terms of my identity. By politics, I suppose I'm a libertarian. I honor liberty more than anything else. Open societies, a fairly minimal requirement for government, perhaps the safety of citizens, and perhaps the rule of law, but not too many other things apart from that. And I'm a vegetarian, which of course in India is very common. This is one of the reasons I love India. It's very easy being vegetarian in India. But in England, when I was born, I think there probably were only about 5,000 vegetarians. It was very, very uncommon. And I came from a family of 5 generations of vegetarian. And I guess that gave me a kind of empathy for the underdog, for the minority, and siding with those perhaps who are in some sense slightly outside of conventional living. So contrarian, libertarian, vegetarian, just 3 identifiers that I would pick up to define myself. And of course, this goes to the question, well, who are you? In what ways would you define your own identity, sense of self, the person you think of yourself as being? I would very much like someone to join the conversation and perhaps provide some answers to that question for yourself, rather in the way that I have just done. Would anyone like to volunteer to put forward some thoughts on this question before we move on?
It's an amazing question. I think it connects with what we have been talking about a couple of times on this platform. Who are you? So if you were to reflect on this question, just type in your response on that as far as the chat box is concerned. Just type your response in the chat box to the response of the question, who are you? Okay, so somebody's saying, I'm an atheist, I'm a learner at work, a provider at home, and a dedicated community member. I'm a leftist. Okay.
Yes. Yes.
What else? Okay, I'm a soul who has been sent on this earth with some purpose.
Wow.
I want to be at peace and balance, but I'm not.
Yes.
Somebody's saying that I'm a river.
A river.
A river, metaphorically.
Yes, beautiful.
Yeah.
Beautiful.
I'm an evolving soul, journey of being catalyst and be a transformationalist. I'm sensitive, I'm learner, committed person, passionate about my work, a developmentalist, value add to lives and identity shall follow. I'm a free-spirited soul, but who often ends up conforming to the societal norms.
That's a lovely, honest one, isn't it?
I am left-hander with little creativity in my mind,
Yes.
often confused and drifting. I'm a simple, positive-minded person who believes in creating magic in life. I'm a contrarian and libertarian too, but not a vegetarian. This is an interesting one. Difficult to be certain as of now, keeps changing. I'm a learner. I'm a human who believes in almighty power and a learner never tired of learning. I'm a medium to help or support others around me. I'm peace and balance. I'm a lotus flower. I'm a mother and a learner. I'm a human. I'm peaceful, loving soul seeking to be change agent. Also, live to learn and share my knowledge. I'm a wholesome, pure love, confidently spreading happiness, harmony, and prosperity. I'm a working woman, multitasking various roles on daily basis. I'm an observer and a dreamer. I'm an epitaph, a learner, and childlike, believing in magic. Oh, I am empathy, I guess. I'm a learner and vulnerable, value justice and fairness, an outlier, freedom of expression, and like a phoenix, rising many times. I'm a seeker, father who's looking to make a difference. I'm a learner. I have a lot of positives and negatives. I'm a free-spirited soul, but who often ends up conforming to the societal norms. I'm a left-hander, creativity in my mind. I'm a learner, purpose-driven value, creator, explorer, human being, a single mother at heart. Wow, interestingly, we identify self. A restless soul who plays multiple roles in life. I'm a seed grown from the soil to a tree and bear fruits for others and shall go back to soil again to grow back. I'm an artist who loves to create a colorful canvas for people around me. I'm a learner and believe in adding value in the lives of humans around me. I'm an eternal optimist. I'm nothing, still everything is in transformation. I'm a simple human being always helping others and a vegetarian. I'm a spirit in human body for human experience. I'm a dreamer, a writer, a learner, human lover and optimist. I'm a wanderer who is learning every day and trying to a better self every day. I'm a human being resident on earth, wanting to enable the flow of divine cosmic energy to one and all that I can interact with to enable them to live their life to the maximum. And that process also live my life to the maximum. I'm a human being who wants to learn from life as much as possible and utilize the same for others to grow in life. A soul that continues to learn and observe, starving for peace. I'm a global citizen who knows we have only planet we must protect, who believes whole planet is one joint family. I'm a rainbow. I am only a minuscule particle in this vast universe. I'm a rainbow. I'm nobody. When I see myself from my limited eyes, and everything in Creator when submits to His grace. I'm a spiritual entity and a human experience. And the last one is I'm a human being who wants to learn as much as from life and utilize the same for others to grow in life. I'm a traveler, and this would continue, um, Jules.
Yes.
So, yeah, I'm a state of mind. I am love and happiness. I'm balance and peace. I'm a traveler. Another, I'm a traveler. I'm a co-passenger. Yeah. So that's where we are. And that's an interesting question.
I'm inspired by that. I think that's absolutely amazing. It's very much, you're all on this wonderful journey. You're all humble. You all know there's growth still to be had. You believe in self-transformation. You have the virtues of love and harmony right at the top of the list. In business school language, we talk about the growth mindset, open to change, open to learning. Many of you referred to learning. Many of you had lovely metaphors, rainbows, rivers. I find that very, very inspiring. I also think that that's where a coaching conversation should begin. I think that from those observations, those self-observations you've all generously and creatively shared with me, it's from those notions that a wonderful conversation could begin that would be much richer and more meaningful to you than perhaps a work-based conversation about achievement. Much richer. Thank you for that. I now want to move on to the 4D model, which, if you like, takes, if you like, identity, belonging, and meaning or purpose, and puts it into a slightly different setting. And of course, Gaurav has already defined the Ds, but just to remind you, the D for destiny is around our genes, our inheritance, our upbringing, the givens in our life, what is sometimes called nature and nurture, the hand of cards that we were dealt at birth, the person we were always meant to be, the gifts that were locked into our genes that needed to find expression, and so on. So that would be the D for destiny. Drama is a very interesting one. Drama are the unexpected things that happened in our lives that we interpreted in a way that made them profoundly important for us. And I'm reminded of a story I heard recently about Bill Clinton, the US president. When he was a teenager, you know, he grew up in Arkansas, didn't he? When he was a teenager, his school was taken on a visit to Washington, D.C., and they visited the White House. And believe it or not, the president was in residence, John F. Kennedy, and Kennedy met these students. He met Bill Clinton and shook Bill Clinton's hand. And as Bill Clinton was shaking JFK's hand, the thought went through his mind, I want to be the president of the United States one day. So he turned, in a sense, an innocent fact, the shaking of a hand, into a life's ambition. It was his way of interpreting that event. And this little quotation from Aldous Huxley at the top of the slide, experience is not what happens, the handshake. It's what we do with what happens to us. He decided to turn that event, that fact, that experience into an aspiration. And that's the drama of life. Our life is made up in part by what I call happenings, these reinterpretations, the seizing of moments of experience and framing them in terms of what we could become, what we might achieve. So that's the drama of life, okay? Then there's the deliberation. These are the, so to speak, choices, not from a particular experience like shaking somebody's hand, but these are pure choice of, pure moments of discovery or choice that we make that shape our lives fundamentally. And to some extent, perhaps too many of us are not deliberating enough in life. We tend to lead our life, I'm thinking of myself at the moment, big periods of my life where I took what happened. I led, if you like, a rather passive life, an enjoyable life, but it wasn't perhaps a life of particular courage or particular deliberation. I went with the flow. I did what was expected of me. I complied with the expectations of parents and teachers and colleagues and bosses. I was, so to speak, a good person. But perhaps deliberation is a bit stronger than that. It's much more living one's life in the active tense rather than just the passive tense. And finally, D for development. These are the projects, the initiatives that we chose that we believe would have a profound influence over us. I went back to school 4 years ago. I went back to university. It was a postgraduate program, a master's degree by research, almost like a mini PhD, but with tutors, with gifted philosophers teaching. And it was in philosophy by research at one of the private universities in Britain, University of Buckingham. Not particularly prestigious, but it had very prestigious teachers, in particular Roger Scruton, who led the program. This was a project I chose to try and re-steer my life towards an interest in different things, read a different kind of literature. And I think it's had a profound impact on me. And I got to reflecting, I wished I'd been braver earlier in my life, perhaps in my mid-40s, and chosen a project of that degree of transformational possibility. So I want to invite you to share a few stories, rather in the way that you did so powerfully around identity. Choose one of the four: destiny, drama, deliberation, and development. And just in the chat box, give one example of that at work, in your own life. And then I'll invite Gaurav, as he did before, to read a selection of your responses. So this is you putting the 4D model to work on your own behalf in relation to your own life. Would that be a fair question?
Jules, before we get there, there's one question that you may want to spend some time not clear on deliberation. Please share some more information, some more understanding around this, please.
Yes. These are, if you like, key choices in our life where we define the person we want to become. Do you remember with Aristotle, pretending to be brave? Let me give an example from my own life. This was when I was 17. I had a very brilliant teacher of English literature. His name was Mr. Depreciate, a Frenchman. And we were studying Shakespeare, and in particular, Hamlet, one of Shakespeare's great tragedies. And we had to write an essay on Hamlet, and we were expected to use the great theories of what Hamlet was about and why it was a great play, and simply play back the ideas of other great authors who'd interpreted Hamlet. And without knowing it, I chose not to do that. I made the decision, I'm going to interpret it through my own eyes as to what I think the play means for me. I'd recently been to Stratford. I'd seen a production of Hamlet, a very brilliant production with Rafe Richardson in the role of Hamlet. And I wrote my own interpretation of Hamlet. And I remember my teacher, Mr. Depreciate, saying, Jules, where did you get these ideas from? Expecting me to say, well, it was so-and-so, it was this author or that critic. And then he realized it was my own interpretation. And he looked at me in a strange way and he said, Jules, well done. You're thinking for yourself. And I remember that moment, thinking for yourself. And it was a huge influence. I then, if you like, made the deliberate choice. I'm the kind of person who doesn't have to take his ideas from authorities. I'm the kind of person who tries to interpret life on my own terms. So it was my own deliberation that this was the way I wanted to try and lead my life. By the way, I think I fail in leading my life in terms of such thinking, such, if you like, self-authorship. But as a 17-year-old, this was at least my intention, okay? Gaurav, does that help with the notion of deliberation?
Yes, so it has provided a better understanding, and people are saying that how they can relate with the existing model that they are using in their life.
Yes.
Also, if you can just spend some time on what is the difference between deliberation and development. So if you can just spend some time, and then we'll get onto your question on different stories that they've been living with.
Yes, that's a very good question. They all overlap, of course, these Ds. A deliberation would be a fresh choice in the moment, a choice as to how I want to live my life. By development, I simply mean going on a university degree, taking one's holiday in a different part of the world, reading a particular book in the belief that this experience would produce change. So it's a halfway house to change. It's saying there's a vehicle here. There's a vehicle for change that I want to adopt, a new friendship, a new line of interest, a new skill I want to adopt. And then that will open up, if you like, new forms of deliberation as to the person we then want to try and become.
Thank you, Jules. Thank you so much. And it is coming together really well. Now, here are a few of the questions, a few of the reflections that people have shared.
Yes.
Now, let me just start with one of my favorite people in the coaching community. She says, deliberation is having ruminated over drastically different behaviors of fellow human beings, decided to commit to a lifetime trajectory of being facilitator for human development and transformation. Thank you, Pervin. You know, you are one of my favorites in this community. Thank you so much for being here. It's a validation that we are moving in the right direction.
Yes.
Another one is, another sharing is that destiny was passing away of my daddy. Drama was interpreted, for it was my time for my mom to be a strong and independent. Deliberation was my mother taking up a decision to be a teacher, and then she trained to be a teacher. And recently, she retired as a department head. Thank you so much, ma'am, for sharing this. This is very inspiring indeed. Kudos to your mom.
Wonderfully candid and intimate. A good conversation has that quality of sharing something that's quite deep within and may not frequently be shared. It's also an act of courage to be able to say something like that. Thank you.
Yeah. Another one is, deliberation is, I made a choice to leave a well-paid job and take up independent consulting in areas I felt was lacking in the industry I was in, which I thought was important at that time. It was humbling and personal gratifying learning experience. Another one is, drama was running after career, which only gave monetary benefits for keeping up with society. But then, when I had to quit the job for personal decision, I did not want to go back to the job, but pursue, which I was always passionate about, training and painting, which led me to go for coaching certification, which gives me thrill of learning and helping people. Painting gives me peace when I paint. Destiny is born to a teacher who had great wisdom, Drama, medical illness gave me time to think who I am. Deliberation, I chose to be an inspirer. Development, I set up 2 consulting firms. Thank you, Nishant. Uh, Development, my initiative and rigor put to become process facilitator and also taking plunge in the coaching world. This was based on my discovery of being a facilitator. I worked, and the next one is I worked as an administrative in the Delhi Public School. Um, Kashmir being volatile, there was no set pattern. And every day a new event or an episode led to fresh discoveries. Besides the innumerable characters in a school of 3,500 students led to making impromptu decisions which resulted in self-evolving. And there are around 19 more sharing. So yeah.
I think an interesting question here, Gaurav, is how many of these turning points are there in a typical life? Are there too many or too few? There's a very celebrated advertising man in Britain who recently said our careers typically are made up of no more than 4 or 5 key moments, key decisions, key insights, key initiatives. In other words, these turning points are relatively rare. And therefore, if they're rare, it's quite important that they're well structured. And again, if we go back to coaching, helping our coachees recognize the importance of these turning points, finding a way of talking about early turning points in their lives that brought fulfillment and happiness and a joy in living, and whether it's time for the next turning point, and if so, what form that turning point might take. Those of you who generously shared these turning points with me, often it started with a frustration that you were not living to your full capacity, that there was a passion that was missing in your life, and you chose to leave something that was relatively safe and try something that was much, much braver. I read a book recently on the regrets we have at the end of our life. When we look back over our lives, what are the greatest sources of regret? The biggest source of regret, certainly in Britain, is I wished I'd had led a life of my own choosing rather than lead a life that others wanted of me or for me. And that ability to, in a sense, take back some degree of personal accountability for the person we become and to set our own criteria for what matters to us. It's a kind of enlightened self-interest, but we have every right to shape our own lives rather than have others shape our lives for us. And those stories you shared were often escaping from perhaps the pressures that others were placing on us, either in the workplace or in the family or friends or whatever, or our education, our teachers, and actually forming our destiny in our own mind and feeling that we have a right to be a person of our own choosing. Now, I was thinking about this model, and this is the final slide before I invite you simply to post some questions or some observations that you'd like to make. And of the 4, destiny, drama, deliberation, and development, I wonder which of these has been the most important? Which lends itself best to a coaching conversation? So in your role as executive coaches and life coaches, if there were one of the Ds that you think is the most important to open up with your clients, which would it be? Which is the most difficult to talk about? I think destiny, for example, is very, very difficult to talk about. The person we were, so to speak, born to be, the cards in our hand, the influence of our parents, of our childhood. It's often said that our siblings had a bigger influence over us than our parents. And it's also said that the friends we make at school have a bigger influence over us than our parents. I think these are very difficult to sort out, to disentangle. and to interpret accurately. So what do you think is the most difficult to talk about? And which of these four is the most misunderstood or misinterpreted? Sorry, I misspelled the word misinterpreted there, forgive me. So again, as before, take just one of those questions and give your answer and why you've chosen that particular answer. Keep it brief and powerful, rather in the way that you have done so far with your brilliant insights. So take a minute or so to think through that.
Okay, so here are the reflections. I think it's destiny. Each one has different interpretations. The second one
Say
says,
again, Gaurav.
I think it's destiny. Each one has different interpretations.
Yes.
Most important is drama, because the events resemble triggers which just happen to you, fortunately.
Yes.
I love the choice of the word drama, because the events resemble triggers which just
Yes, of course.
happen to you, fortunately. The next one is drama. So many unexpected events shaped my choices. The next one is most difficult to understand is destiny. Most people don't understand how destiny shape lives. Destiny and development. The next one is drama, most important. The next one is most easy to connect is drama. Events resemble with others. The next one is for most of my life, I led my life as if it was a drama, until I realized I can deliberate upon my life and make choices. The next one is I think development, because here lies actions and future. Drama and deliberation. The next one is difficult to talk about is deliberation. You need clarity of mind to introspect. What is most misunderstood is drama, because one tends to see the events for his or her perceived sense of reality, not from the eyes of reality. I shall repeat that. This is really interesting. Misunderstood is drama, because one tends to see the events of his or her perceived sense of reality, not from the eyes of reality. Difficult to understand is it will take acceptance to move on. Deliberation followed by development. The next one is I do what is my passion. The next one is destiny requires acceptance, which is a hard task.
Yes.
The next one is most difficult to talk about is drama, because that's where people often are stuck. The next one is drama. All unexpected events in my life gave courage and confidence. The next one is destiny. Most difficult to talk about, because it's easy to blame destiny and we keep doing it. The next one is destiny again. Most difficult to talk about this. We have already spoken about this. The next one is deliberation and drama for coaching conversations.
Yes.
The next one is, for me, it is deliberation. It is very difficult to anyone to understand why you choose what you have to choose. As Steve Jobs said, you can't connect dots looking forward, but by looking backwards. The next one is deliberation. Deliberation is the most misunderstood, as that's the visible one, however, is driven by the individual's drama and destiny. The next one is most easy to discuss is drama and difficult to understand, implement results from deliberation point of view. The next one is most difficult to talk about is development. As people do not understand how can someone continue to study even after post-graduation. And here we have a PhD who's always studying, who's always reflecting. So, Jules, possibly I think that was a personalized comment to you.
Well, yeah. What intelligent and interesting observations. I've learned something here, particularly around drama and how that connected with you all. It's both important, it's highly influential, it's a wonderful basis for coaching and so on. So I hope in those Ds there are, if you like, new instruments that you can use in your coaching conversations, or indeed in conversations with your children. I have 6 kids. I have kids in their early 50s and kids in their early 30s. And one of the big influences that going through a coaching program myself was that I started to have different and much better conversations with my children. and perhaps there's something around the D's that again could furnish a really interesting conversations within the family, not simply in the workplace. So let me close with just a quick summary of the key thoughts, and then invite you to post whatever questions or insights you'd like.
Yeah, there are
so
few
we
questions.
Yes.
So there are a few questions that I'm going to ask you once you conclude. Thank you.
Yeah, so very quickly, the notion that life is not just a question of self-expression, but also self-creation, inventing ourselves as well as discovering ourselves, the power of pretending to a virtue, perhaps that we aspire to have, and therefore becoming a different, more virtuous or better person, the recognition of agency, willpower, choice. One of you has just mentioned blaming, how easily we can blame destiny for the person we are. I was born to be angry, as opposed to how do I surmount my anger? For example, victimhood is extremely common as an excuse or as a notion in Western culture at the moment, and it's led to I think a deterioration in our civilization. And that coaching is around the reconstruction of self, our own, but also our clients, the recognition that we can bring our own agency to bear on the person we are, the 4D model, which we've just worked through, and if you like, the mutuality or sharedness of the coaching conversation. It's not expert to novice. It's one human being to another human being, grappling with many of the same issues, and perhaps each coaching the other. So there's more of an equality of relationship in the coaching conversation around the 4D model. So let me close there and invite you to post questions or insights. Thank you so much for listening, by the way, and for sharing what you already have shared. Extremely powerful.
Thank you, Jules. Here is the first question for you. The first question is, I believe drama would be one to start the conversation with the coachee, as these events will define who, what, and how the person chooses to be. What are your thoughts on this?
Yes. Yes, this came to me recently, the importance of what I'm calling happenings, not just drama. I mean, drama is a wonderful word, of course. And it came from a conversation with Robert Plomin, the author of a wonderful book published earlier this year called Blueprint. And Blueprint is really the current state of knowledge in terms of the power of nature and nurture in terms of the person we become. So it's a geneticist, remember, so a slightly deterministic biological model of identity. And he has very powerful evidence based upon twin studies, identical twin studies brought up in different environments, that our nature, our genetic inheritance accounts for something like 70% of whom we are. But in terms of the remaining 30%, which is where nurture comes in, there are no clear patterns. And therefore, there are things more like drama and happenings that in that small space left to us is available to become the person we are. And therefore, in some sense, I agree with those of you who think this is the best space for a coaching conversation. It's taking perhaps something that happened in one's life that one really hasn't come to terms with, and placing an interpretation on that event that allows you to move on from that experience. Mary Douglas, the great anthropologist, talked about using, for example, if you were abused by a father who kept losing his temper with you and beat you. This was the example she gave. In the passive voice, you allow that to determine your life thereafter. So you can use that as the excuse to be violent yourself, or to lead some kind of life of hardship. But Mary Douglas's point is we still have within us the reasoning agency that can reinterpret that. One could say, my father couldn't help it. He had other virtues. My experience of his anger makes me determined never to express that kind of anger towards another person. So it's I think it's a wonderful basis for a coaching conversation, the reinterpretation of key events.
The next question is, okay, so how to handle imposter syndrome using 4D framework?
Imposter syndrome. Gosh, what a good question. I hadn't thought of that, because in a sense, the imposter is the false person, isn't it? Pretending to be someone we're not. And I'm arguing that perhaps the art of life is to pretend and then become someone better than ourselves. I suppose the difference here is whether the imposter is a deterioration in the quality of our life, an excuse for being the person we are, rather than to be an object of our own positive, virtuous creativity. It's a very interesting question. You've encouraged me to reflect on that and think about it, because in some respects, being an imposter is to be inauthentic. What is it? What's the difference between choosing to be someone other than whom we are authentically and inauthentically? It's a very good question. I'd love to hear, if you were to email me, I'd love to hear what your own thoughts are on that. Thank you.
Okay, the next one is, how do you coach around the past events to be able to create awareness instead to get sunk into the real drama?
Oh gosh, yes. I suppose that is, in some respects, to help them tell that story in as calm a manner as possible, in some sense to abstract themselves from the turmoil of the event, to somehow de-accentuate the emotion surrounding that event and tell it purely as a descriptive narrative. What happened, what was said, what was seen, so that, in a sense, without the emotion clouding the experience or disguising the experience, we are better able to reinterpret that experience and perhaps surround it with a different quality of emotion. So it's abstracting the facts from the emotions, if we can, and dealing with the facts and reinterpreting the facts to mean something different from the meaning we extracted from it at the time. Would that be a fair answer?
The next question is, how does one handle destiny in coaching as per people, neither overestimate their capacities or depreciate their capabilities?
Yes, because part of coaching traditionally has been to remind the coachee of the potency they have and the willpower, perhaps the willpower that has not been exercised, and to set a standard of agency that has perhaps been missing in their life. So again, storytelling can be powerful. Sharing a story from one's own life as a coach, where one gave oneself permission to be more ambitious, to assume a competence that we hadn't felt we hadn't got, but by pretending to have that competence, sort of build that competence. So much of coaching is setting the bar at a slightly higher level and not allowing, if you like, a sense of inability or incompetence to prevent us exercising ambition. We live in times where perhaps it's very easy to settle for a mediocre life, perhaps a comfortable life, but not a life that stretches our imagination or our sense of our own potency. And therefore, the inspirational quality of a gifted coach, I mean, the way you talked about your own lives a moment ago, for me, I found extremely inspirational. And in a sense, reminded me that I could be a much better person than the one I am. So you drove me to a belief that don't settle on the competence you think you have, set a higher standard of capability.
Thank you. There are some amazing questions coming here. Yeah, so you may want to address this question, Jules, very interesting question. It says how to suspend the coach's value system from impacting the exchange of thoughts.
Yes, that's a wonderful question. It's almost impossible, isn't it? I mean, when I was talking about, my contrarian nature and so on, I'm sure I get stuck with that. Whereas actually, the ability to leave behind one's own values, my libertarianism, my vegetarianism, and all of that stuff. What a good question, because there, in a sense, we're coaching ourselves to be more flexible in the way we ask questions and to somehow lose our own convictions and prejudices and biases in the act of coaching. What a good question. I think simply asking the question and reminding ourselves that there are many ways of leading a good life other than the way in which we as a coach are leading our life. The plurality of options, the amazing diversity of human goodness, the amazing number of heroes we could choose to emulate, and reminding ourselves that there is more than one version of a good life. It often goes back to pluralism. The Greeks believed that values were all inconsistent with one another, that the virtues are fighting one another, their gods were all fighting one another. It wasn't a perfectly harmonious set of values. So you can have kindness fighting honesty. They're both virtues, but there are some occasions where it's kind to be dishonest and where honesty can be very cruel. And therefore recognizing the plurality of values and conscientiously leaving behind our own convictions and prejudices when we enter into the coaching conversation, and perhaps to invite our coachee to challenge us if they feel we're simply bringing our own prejudices to the party, to the conversation, and giving them a right to push back against any sense of our superiority, if it comes across in that way, or our narrowness of vision. What a good question.
Thank you. Now, this is another interesting question. So it says, how far is self-coaching important in a drama that the coach himself, herself, keeps constantly drives into?
Yes, in a way, this is the Freudian concept. Freud did not allow anyone to become a psychoanalyst until they themselves had been psychoanalyzed. Freud kept the option that he didn't need to be psychoanalyzed, but all other analysts had to go through an intense period of analysis themselves. I think this is a very wise observation, and I think a good coach needs to themselves have a coach and to keep experiencing what it's like to be on the receiving end of gifted coaching, not simply to learn better the art of coaching, but in a sense to encourage more self-reflection, more self-knowledge, which is, I think, absolutely fundamental to gifted coaching. We can't help others know themselves if we have a very poor understanding of ourselves, and therefore that question, I think, goes to the heart of a lot of it, using perhaps another coach to help us self-coach, and perhaps encouraging those we're coaching also to self-coach. Thank you for that good question.
Yeah, there's another wonderful question. It says, how do you relate 4D model to change management?
I think the conventional model of change is very much around a goal that needs to be achieved in a different manner. Whereas I think the 4D model is saying that you don't start necessarily with a goal unless it's a very vague goal of living a more fulfilling life, which in itself is not particularly helpful, I don't think. The 4D coaching model, I think, starts with the notion of inquiry or curiosity rather than a goal to be met. So getting to a better question rather than getting to a clearer goal. It's a different way of looking at reasoning power. I think it's also true in business that a good business strategy begins with a question rather in a way that science always begins with a question. Science doesn't begin with a goal other than the vague goal of increasing knowledge, but that's not a helpful goal. That's a truism, isn't it? And therefore, I think with the 4D model, I'm trying to suggest that it's the quality of the curiosity that we're playing upon, that we're trading upon or relying upon, rather than the unmet goal that is the focus of the conversation.
There's one more question. It says, how do you approach the 4D model with family and kids? Really curious to understand this aspect too.
Yes. It reminds me of when my youngest boy was in his late teens. He criticized me as being a rather poor father. I'm sure he's absolutely right. And I said, look, and it was at the time when I was going through my coaching education. And I simply said to him, look, Zane, write out, if you like, 10 pieces of advice or 10 commandments that if I were to, or 10 rules, that if I were to follow them, would render me a better father than I am at the moment. And he went away and wrote these 5 rules. He's now 32. He sometimes reminds me to go back to the rules. But there's something in that turning to the child to become the coach of the adult that's extremely powerful. I haven't put it in a 4D framework. I've simply put it in a standard coaching framework. But perhaps in a 4D framework, it might be a conversation around the interpretation of key events in the child's life. Children are very good at picking up on something that gave them cause for concern, returning to that moment and encouraging a reinterpretation of that moment in life, so it steers them towards a happier country than a sadder country, maybe one way of thinking about it.
And there's another question. It says, should I be value agnostic while dealing with coaches' life choices?
Yes, I think so. I don't think there are answers here. I think there's good conversation, but we need to leave the right to make choices to the coachee. We can inquire into the basis of the choice. We can inquire into where that choice of value might lead them as a person. But we should be absolutely agnostic around whether we find that particular virtue or value good or bad. I don't think that's our role. We're not a priest.
Super. So there are a few more questions, but because the paucity of the time, we'll have to close the session right now. Thank you so much, ladies and gentlemen. It was fantastic having you all on this webinar. And as always, you were very, very interactive, added a lot of value. It gave me a lot of instances where I started reflecting on my own self. So thank you so much. Thank you so much, Jules, on behalf of X Monks. Thank you so much.
Thank you all very, very much.